Welcome to this presentation produced by the Association for Preservation Technology, APT, with support from the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, NCPTT. Please note that this presentation is copyrighted and reproduction, distribution, display, and use of any material in this recording without written permission of the presenter is prohibited.
Hello, and welcome to this presentation sponsored by the Association for Preservation Technology and the National Center for the Preservation Technology and Training for this session on materials preservation. My name is Mary Jablonski. I'm an architectural conservator with a strong interest in architectural finishes, including coatings. Today, I will be talking about architectural coatings in a historic context. The stated learning objectives are listed here. This presentation is going to be a very abbreviated look at historic architectural coatings in a historical context. The focus is going to be on paints and clear coatings. This is an overview, and there's a great deal of information left out of this talk. Also, I'm leaving out the huge topic of decorative painting and the incredible variety of materials used to produce these finishes. That is another presentation. I have also shamelessly used images off the internet to illustrate points I am making, and I have noted where I've used those. If I own the materials or took the photographs, I have not credited myself. The importance of architectural coatings cannot be overstated as they are applied to almost all buildings in the world. They are used for both protection and decoration. Their importance is manifold, and understanding what the coatings are and the history of architectural coatings gives us a broader understanding of not only the people who had their buildings coated, but also the painters who applied the coatings, the history of the industry and trade, and even the economics of the period. So for this presentation, architectural coatings are paint and clear coatings. And let's begin by taking a look at what these coatings are. Now, paint is a colored substance spread over a surface that dries to leave a thin, decorative or protective coating. Traditionally, paints were divided into two basic types of coatings based upon the liquid, water, or oil. Regardless of which type of paint was being used, there are three basic components to a paint: the vehicle, the binder, and the pigment. Now, the binder and the pigment can be the same. The vehicle is the liquid substance that holds the paint ingredients together and allows the paint to be spread along the surface in a thin layer. When paint made with a drying oil is applied to a surface, the oil absorbs the oxygen, polymerizes, holding the pigment to the surface. For water-based paints before the 20th century, the water evaporated and the binder cured through carbonization of the lime. Or if it was calcimine, the glue mixed in with the binder dried to hold the paint film to the substrate. Usually, water-based paints dried in one day. They weren't as durable as oil-based paints, but they certainly weren't as toxic either. Now, the binder creates the film and binds the pigment into the film. The quality of the binder had a direct impact on durability and adhesion. The pigment is the material that colors the paint. As noted earlier, it can also be the binder. So having identified our basic paint components, let's take a look at the different types of paint. I'm starting with oil-based paints because we all have a better sense of what oil-based paint coatings are. They're fairly similar in consistency, storage, and applications in many ways to modern paints. Linseed oil, sometimes with a solvent, often without, was the most common vehicle, though other oils such as walnut oil were used. By the 20th century, Asian oils were understood to increase the drying properties of paint, and tung oil, soybean oil, perilla oil, chinawood oil, and others were common drying oils used in paints. Their use started in the manufacture of varnish, but they were soon added to the flat interior and even exterior paints. Now, linseed oil is still used in the paint industry today, not widely, but it is. These images are from a farm and linseed oil factory in England that I visited last summer. While linseed oil is a drying oil, it still could take days for the oil to dry. So The addition of Asian oils helped, but so did some of the pigments. Now, there are many pigments such as lead white, red lead, and some of the ochres that actually act as drying catalysts. Other pigments, however, retard the drying process, and these can include carbon blacks and Prussian blue. For most oil-based paints, the binder was lead white, or by the middle of the 19th century, lead white and zinc oxide. Both, again, are considered pigments. All lead that was used in paints in the 13 colonies had been imported either from England or France. And it wasn't until after the American Revolutionary War that lead factories were established in the United States. In 1809, Sam Weatherhills Jr. built a factory in Philadelphia to produce white lead. Now, white lead was also used in glass manufacturing as well. It may not have been the first, but it was certainly one of the earliest lead manufacturing firms in the US. The Weatherhills firm also was one of the earliest to develop a process for making zinc oxide. And this was used both as a partial substitute for lead and even occasionally a substitute for lead in the paint manufacturing business. It had been discovered that the zinc did not yellow as much as the white lead, and even better, it didn't blacken when in contact with the sulfur-laden air from manufacturing or sulfur pigments. Now, paint factories started mixing zinc oxide with the white lead in the middle of the 19th century, somewhere around 1850. Kirsten Moffat Travers, an architectural conservator and conservation scientist, along with Catherine Matson, a conservation scientist, discovered that zinc oxide can be identified visually in cross-sectional analysis as it sparkles. It has become a very useful dating tool. Now, pigments prior to the early 19th century that were used in this country were usually earth pigments. It was what was available in the vicinity to the painter. And they included red ochre, yellow ochre, burnt umber, charcoal, which is also known as carbon black, burnt bones, which is known as bone black, raw sienna, and burnt sienna. These earth pigments were less expensive than any imported pigments and continued to be used extensively. The best imported pigments were German pigments. Now, synthetic pigments were also being developed in the 18th century, and one of the earliest was Prussian blue. It was not a particularly stable pigment, used extensively, but it has faded over time. Other pigments followed, particularly in the 19th century, when blues such as artificial ultramarine and reds such as vermilion, yellow zinc chromate were brought into use. And many of the pigments in this period could also be toxic. Some of the best known toxic ones are the arsenic Scheele's green and Paris green, as well as the lead-based pigments litharge, yellow lead oxide, mineral orange, roasted white lead, chrome yellow, lead chromate. This is only a partial list that I have here, and there are others, but it is of concern and one needs to be careful with them. Now, water-based paints have water and sometimes glue or casing for the vehicle, whiting, lime, or even lead for the binder, and alkali-resistant pigments. You have to have alkali-resistant pigments because these are alkaline paints. Now, there's a lot of confusion about the names of water-based paints. They're called distemper, lime wash, whitewash, calcimine in various spellings, and casing. There are important differences between this paint, and it's really important to be clear about what paint you have. If you need to use a general term, please use the term distemper because it basically covers all of them. Lime wash is one of the earliest coatings. It was made with slaked lime for the binder and water the vehicle. It was used as a traditional shelter coat for the exterior of a building, and it offered protection and durability to the lime stuccos and lime mortars, which could be easily washed away, but it also protected brickwork, plasterwork, and stone masonry. It is a non-toxic, relatively non-toxic type of paint, and it also had hygienic properties and acted as a mild fungicide due to its high alkalinity, which is why lime wash was traditionally used in barns, food, storage areas, and preparation areas. And I put in the house on the left just so you can see the type of stucco that would be covered by a lime wash. Now, both lime washes and, a whitewash can also have lime, but it also used chalk or whiting, or even occasionally gypsum for the binder, and casein or glue with water for the vehicle. It could be used in many of the same locations as a lime wash, and both lime wash and whitewash, as previously noted, cure through carbonization. It was commonly overpainted, often with many layers with the same materials. In theory, it should have been washed off, but was often left to put on layer after layer. Now, both of these types of finishes could be colored, and the coloring had to be with earth pigments, which were alkali stable. I have seen a bakery with brick dust used for coloring, and it had multiple layers of both lime wash and whitewash. If you wanted a very cool white for your whitewash, you would use a blue laundry dye or the ultramarine pigments to pigment the coating. Now, around 1840, calcimine paint came into being and became one of the prominent water-based paints. Not exactly sure of the history of it, how much it had been used before that, but you start to see publications discussing it. Now, calcimine paint had glue added to the water vehicle, but it had a whiting binder and often a pigment. Whiting is a white chalk, sometimes called Paris white, which comprised the main ingredient. It's a form of calcium carbonate that's powdered and then washed to remove impurities. Used as a pigment, it increased the opacity of water-based paints, and because it was significantly cheaper than white lead, it was often used to bulk oil-based paints. The quality of the whiting could vary, which not only affected the opacity of the paint, but also the amount of glue required to make the calcimine workable. The glue, oftentimes referred to as white glue, was basically a hide glue. Now, it wasn't necessary to tint calcimine, but if you did, of course, you would be limited to the paints that were basically alkaline resistant. And if you notice on the right-hand side of this image, you can see these very pastel colors. That is essentially what you get with these water-based paints. Now, other ingredients could be added to the calcimine, which would alter characteristics of the paint. The most prevalent was probably alum to harden it. And later, when it was started to be produced commercially, clay or kaolin, which rendered the paint much easier to manufacture and easier to apply. Now, I've thrown this slide of alabastine in because it called itself a non-calcimine paint, but essentially it was very similar, but made of gypsum. And one of the interesting things about this paint, I'd never heard about it until I'd seen a few advertisements. And then doing some further research, I realized that it was an extensively used paint, but fell out of use by the 1930s. And I do want to point out on the right-hand side is probably the first fan deck that was produced. And this company had it. Now, various ingredients are added throughout the period to calcimine paints in order to try to make them more durable and washable. I mean, calcimine paints were not durable, and they easily just rubbed off or washed off. So in the early 20th century, as resins and ingredients were added, they created more complex paints that could no longer be called calcimines, as you can see in this image. One of these new paints was a casein paint made by using casein and milk protein instead of hide glue. Although often confused with calcimine paint, dried casein paints were insoluble in water, making these coatings washable. The use of calcimine paints faded away by the late 1920s as they were replaced by casein paints and then later more durable water-based paints. So let's take a look now at clear coatings. These are a homogeneous, transparent, or translucent liquid that is converted to a solid, transparent film after being applied in a thin layer. They generally contain a resin that dries to a hard, often shiny, transparent film. They can have pigment placed in them, but unpigmented coatings are often slightly yellow due to the oil used to produce them. Now, a clear finish provides a protective coating over materials, often paint, wood, or metal, that guards it against water damage and natural wear and tear. It can also actually, in the case of wood, bring out the wood figure or appearance. Now, to make oil varnishes, originally resins had to be boiled into the raw linseed oil until the resin melted and dissolved. You could use a softer damar resin, which could be dissolved in turpentine without heat, but most of them appear to be copal. Now, most of the clear coats were varnish, shellacs, and glazes. I'm not going to discuss really the oil-based glazes in any detail. They were generally made using linseed oil and were applied as part of an interior decorative finish. They're often very thin layers that were commonly pigmented to create a finish with depth. Now, you will find the word varnish broadly used to describe any type of clear surface coating. Some period documents refer to varnishes as lacquers, an expression that most likely resulted from attempts to imitate the shiny depth of the Oriental lacquer with a more Western varnish. Now, historically, there were three types of varnishes: spirit, essential oil, and fixed oil. All these types of varnishes could be used on a building, and most were, again, a blend of resin, dryer oil, dryer, and volatile solvent. When the varnish dried, its solvent portion evaporated, and the remaining constituents oxidized or polymerized to form this durable film. Now, varnishes were used on carriage bodies, which means they ended up being used on cars, but they were also used on cabinets, interior woodwork, exterior woodwork, such as windows and doors. And it would have been applied over decoratively painted items, such as wood grain doors and painted wainscots. It sealed and it protected. The most common varnish used in the United States appears to have been copal varnish, based on the research of architectural conservator Andrew Fearon. Spirit varnishes were simple solutions of resin in a solvent, often turpentine, and did not contain oil. Small amounts of this type of varnish could be added to paint, and if it was small enough, it wouldn't affect its durability. But applying it in any significant quantity would have made the paint too brittle. It was used over paint often for a shining appearance. Shellac was another very common clear coat, mainly used for interior applications. Shellac, as the word is commonly used, refers to all forms of purified lac, a natural resin secreted by the tiny lac insect on certain trees, principally found in India and Thailand. It remained the most widely used protective finish for wood until the 1920s and 30s. The development of synthetic resin compounds early in the 20th century, together with advances in varnish formulation, heralded the end of shellac's industrial and architectural dominance. Ironically, many of the newly developed resins, such as bakelite and similar phenolic-based compounds, were created by researchers attempting to synthesize shellac. The invention of nitrocellulose lacquer in 1921 by the DuPont Chemical Company for the auto industry was the beginning of the end for shellac. It had qualities that made it easier to apply, dry quickly, and it could be polished to a high gloss very easily, unlike the elaborate shellac polishing process. After World War II, alkylate varnishes were developed, and by the 1950s, the public was introduced to the first oil-based polyurethanes. The use of shellac was relegated to woodworkers. Now, paints and clear coatings were artisanal materials until the third quarter of the 19th century, and then they began to transition into commercial production. However, some painters continued to produce their own paints well into the 20th century. But artisanal paint was a complicated, difficult, skilled, and labor-intensive process. All painters had their own formulas and tricks, not only for making their paint, but for applying it. The transition of the production of paint from an artisanal process to a commercial production was not an overnight occurrence. It began with pigment mills that came into existence at the end of the 19th century. Painters knew that pigments, including lead, were toxic. Using a grinding mill meant that it was less dangerous than grinding by hand. The painter bought ground pigment, but then had to prepare it for adding to his paint ingredients by grinding it in oil. This was the first step in making paint, and with the Mueller and slab that you can see on your left, it was an incredibly labor-intensive process. Batches of color were often inconsistent, and some painters were probably more patient than others and ground their paint more carefully. Their pigment particle size was probably fairly small. Less conscientious painters had larger pigment particles in their paint. The smaller the pigment particle, the more dispersed it would be in the paint and more uniform the color. It was only with the development of the modern paint industry that color manufacturing provided consistent colors. And you can just see, I put an image on the right, sort of showing how little amounts of pigment would be ground when you were using a Mueller. Now, some painters ground their pigments in oil in large batches and kept them in ox, sheep, or pig's bladders. The bladder was pricked and the amount of pigment needed was then squeezed out of it. The hole then closed over. This is an old dried bladder that was found in an attic and forgotten, but it gives you an idea of how these ground pigments were stored. Painters had to make buckets of paint for each job. If a painter was painting a room or a house, he had to be careful to use the paint from one bucket on each wall, or else the wall would end up two-toned where he had started with the next bucket. Now, water-based paints were just as complicated, if not more so. Although the ingredients of the paint may have been straightforward, this did not mean that they were easy to mix together and apply to a wall. And I would like to do a little quote from the Painting and Decorating a Journal. They noted about these water-based paints. This work is done to the best advantage in a cool and moderately warm weather, as very warm and dry atmosphere will dry the material too rapidly for easy working. A good formula for making the coating material is as follows: 10 pounds of Gilder's Best Whiting or calcimine, 1/2 of a pound of Best White glue or gelatin, 1/4 of a pound of alum, pulverized, and a trifle of ultramarine blue if it is to be white or other color if not. Soak the glue in cold water until it jellies. Then pour on hot water and stir until the glue or gelatin are completely dissolved, which will occur in a few moments. Whiting or other calcimine should be soaked in water overnight to slake it, and then pour over it the hot glue and additional hot water, sufficient to thin up the size properly. The alum may be dissolved in hot water. The blue may be mixed with water before adding to the whiting, and colors should be first wetted and beaten up with a paddle and then added to the mixture. The first coat is better applied hot, but subsequent coats must be put on cold. Note that you would have had to have a source of heat if you were going to be applying calcimine coat paints in this period. It gives you a sense of why commercially produced paints, when they came on the market, were adopted fairly quickly. The manufacture of ready-mix paints was a result of the Industrial Revolution. Improvements in machinery, the growth of the rail and shipping transport, industrial finance, and organization. These all created the incentive to produce commercial paints. And in 1867, D.R. Averill of Ohio patented the first prepared or ready-mix paint in the United States. While improvements to equipment were a major component of commercial production of paint, such as these paint mills here, the main obstacle that had to be overcome was packaging. Advances in packaging of goods came during the American Civil War. The Army had to move food for its soldiers. Cans and cardboard boxes were essential, and it was modifications to this packaging that was used for paint containers. In 1868, the first patent was given for the metal paint can with a tight-fitting top to an E.B. Hamlin of St. Louis. For the first time, paint could be manufactured in great mass, packaged in the newly patented cans, and shipped to stores throughout the country. For calcimine and similar type paints such as alabastine, there was the cardboard box. The first commercially produced calcimine paint was Johnston's dry-sized calcimine. Interestingly, Johnston had been involved with cardboard packaging during the Civil War and appears to have taken his knowledge into the paint industry. Commercially produced calcimine was easy to use as it only had to be taken from the box, put into a pail, and mixed with water. It's noteworthy that while painters complained about the loss of quality with commercially produced oil-based paints, this was not the case for calcimine. It was cheaper and easier for painters to buy commercial calcimine than to make their own. Now, the main challenges in making oil mixed paints was obtaining complete dispersion of the pigment in the vehicle and then keeping it from settling and separating. Once it did separate, a lot of elbow grease was needed to create the proper dispersion again. Now, both of these concerns required the pigment to be ground extremely fine. Achieve the proper consistency was another tricky matter. Particles dispersed more easily in a thin paint than in a thick one, but they settled out more easily in these thinner paints. In addition, a thin paint, while easy to apply, remained usable longer, but it required more coats of paint. As the early patent paints or ready-mix paints had a poor reputation, it was because they were thin and lacked opacity. The widespread use of lime and calcium carbonate instead of the more expensive white lead produced paint that streaked. Some manufacturers diluted their paints with too much water. Others add crushed pebbles to make the cans heavier. Yet, despite this initial poor quality of patent paints, there was a market for them. A rapidly industrializing America needed more and more paint to protect and beautify its houses, its barns, ships, carriages, buildings, and railroads. Paint and varnish production grew. In 1890, ready-mix paints accounted for about 22% of all of the production of paint materials and products, and it was mainly used for house paint. It soon grew well beyond the house paint into manufacturing and commercial spaces. And for anyone researching these early commercial paints, there were a multitude of names for them, including ready-made paint, ready-mix paint, prepared paints, and chemical paints. And marketing was a key component for selling paint. The earliest marketing materials, such as what you can see on the screen here, were geared to the painter with paint brochures that had paint chips. But it soon became clear that it was even more profitable to market to the consumer as well as the painter, and to give guidance to the consumer so they felt comfortable that they would have a fashionable and tasteful painted job. Showing people the possibility of paint gained customers. The demand for ready-mix paint required uniformity of quality, contents, and color in each can. So, to keep up with demand, scientists were now needed to create uniformity. This led to the era of chemical revolution in the paint industry. Now, Sherwin-Williams, in its history on its website, notes that it hired its first chemist in 1884. But according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, as late as 1910, so few chemists were occupied with the paint industry that it was said that one of them could probably name all of the others. What made consistency in chemistry essential in the paint industry was the assembly line production. December 1st, 1913, Henry Ford brought the assembly line into his factory. It was apparently met with a lot of hatred and suspicion by his workers. However, his main problem was a chief bottleneck in the mass production of cars that was snail-like in pace of refinishing. 21 days for painting and drying the many coats that were applied. So, chemical advances to the paint industry was essentially created by the needs of the auto industry. Now, paint industry's answer to the whole problem was nitrous cellulose lacquer and later synthetic enamel. It reduced drying time from days to hours. But it wasn't just cars in this period. Every product created on an assembly line, from the Model T to appliances such as washing machines, required extensive use of paints and coatings to beautify, protect, and extend the life of the manufactured good. Mind you, those washing machines are not what we know as washing machines today. The key ingredients to making quick-drying paints were synthetic resins. Mixtures of different synthetic resins were often incorporated into a paint to furnish properties that weren't provided by a single resin. And while the amount of resin in paint could vary, the choice of resins were made for particular applications that depended on factors such as appearance, ease of application, cost, resistance to chemicals, heat, and wear. Some of the most frequently used resins in paints and varnishes and lacquers included cellulose, phenolic, alkyd, vinyl, acrylic, methacrylic, polyurethane, chlorinated rubber, and styrene butadiene resins, and it goes on the list. Now, in addition to adding resins, paints began to trend towards emulsion-type paints. Emulsions are the mixing of two or more liquids that normally cannot be mixed. Traditional paint cured through evaporation of the vehicle. Emulsion paints cured through a two-step process. In the first phase, water evaporates from the paint film. As the water evaporates, the particles migrate to the paint surface. The second part of the curing process occurs when, under the action of surface tension, the particles coalesce to form a continuous film. And it's during the second part of this process that the curing becomes irreversible. Now, some of the earliest emulsion paints were paste emulsion paints. And paste paints were a mix of water-based paste paint in an oil. The paste of these paints became suspended in the oil when mixed, and these paints were produced for both interior and exterior applications. And exterior applications included concrete buildings that were being lit by early electric lighting, and these paints were flat, which the lighting therefore did not show up a lot of the defects in the concrete. It's not clear how durable these paints were, and its use was certainly for a limited time period, the 1920s through 40s. We have found some of these paints for interior finishes, and they are affected by water, or at least some of them are. And we found that some of the surfaces hazed when attempts were made to clean them. Further research is definitely needed on these finishes. Now, the war challenged the paint industry. Many traditional materials were not available. This included linseed oil or bristles used for brushes. A wide variety of substitutions had to be made. Soybean oil was substituted for linseed oil and paint rollers for brushes. In this advertisement, it notes at the very bottom corner, which I've highlighted in red, that their paint is a soybean product. And emulsion paints using available materials were used extensively during the Second World War. It would be an interesting research topic to determine how well some of these paints held up. But to apply these paints, a new application method had to be found because bristles were in very short supply. Sherwin-Williams likes to lay claim for the invention of the paint roller, but it was invented in 1940 by a Canadian, Norman Brakey, from Toronto, who died unfortunately shortly after he invented the roller for applying these emulsion paints. Today, modern American emulsion paints are called latex. Latex evolved because there was an excess of styrene butadiene after the war, and the industry producing it was geared for large-scale production, so new uses had to be found. Someone decided to try it in emulsified paint when it was discovered that styrene butadiene improved washability and gloss in other products. And so latex was born in the late 1940s as a way to use surplus war materials. It is not clear which company produced the first commercial latex paint. It is probably that it was the Glidden Company, which claims to have invented the first waterborne latex paint in 1948. And here you can see an advertisement where they have, from 1951, claiming that it had been in use 3 years. Latex paint is a commercial polymer emulsion, and it, as well as other modern paints, have many ingredients in them in addition to the binder, vehicle, and pigments. These ingredients determine performance properties. Amongst the list of ingredients are coalescing agents required to control the drying process, surfactants for particle formulation, stabilization, defoamers to counteract the foaming tendency of the surfactant, freeze-thaw agents, pH buffers, preservatives, and biocides, thickeners to control viscosity, wetting, and dispersing agents, etc. So modern paints are no longer manufactured in one plant. Instead, each paint manufacturer buys a variety of chemicals from chemical companies that were then compounded in the paint factory. So paint companies really no longer manufacture their paint materials, they only mix them. One other coating I'd like to mention is potassium silicates. And while we don't know how extensively they were used, I'm putting this in as a reminder to us all that there are coatings out there that we know very little about their historic use. These coatings were waterborne inorganic paints and stains used on potassium silicate binders, potassium silicate binders. They were initially used over lime stuccos in Europe and have been in use for over a century. The Germans appear to have been the first to fabricate them, so of course in the 1930s when the war came, they were no longer being imported. They have been found on Rockefeller Center and undoubtedly on many other places. They are a breathable, durable coating that has come back into the United States in the 1990s. Now, when discussing historic paint, it's necessary to understand health and safety issues. The paint industry was very slow to remove lead pigments from its paint. It was known for a long time lead was unhealthy for painters, and many seem to have a sense that it was not healthy for inhabitants either, because water-based paints continued to be used continuously. It wasn't until 1918 that a new white pigment, titanium dioxide, was basically produced to replace white lead. It took a while to get this pigment improved so that the paint did not break apart. But the paint industry began limiting the use of lead pigments, in the 1950s, when manufacturers led a voluntary effort to remove lead from house paints. It wasn't particularly good, but it took until 1978 when the Consumer Product Safety Commission banned the use of lead in consumer paints. So if you're dealing with historic paints in old buildings, hygiene is important. Wash your hands and wash your clothes. Now, all too often, when you work with historic paints and you do any type of research on historic paints, the question that's asked is, what color is it? But this is not adequate for most projects. If the building is to be repainted or repairs are to be made, an immediate question should be, what types of paint do I have? And are there any compatibility or deterioration issues I should be aware of? Painted finishes can fail for a number of reasons. And the causes of paint failure are water infiltration, failure of the underlying paint, incompatible paints, and shrinkage of the paint film. Distemper paints deteriorate, and it's generally because the glue is no longer functioning as a binder, which weakens the paint. It will frequently be chalky. Originally, this paint was to have been washed off and new calcium paint applied, but over time there were layered buildups. So much of this calcium paint is not particularly well bonded as it has aged. And one problem that is often discovered too late is repainting ceilings with latex paint. If there are water-based paints under the visible paint, failure often occurs because moisture penetrates cracked paint and it dissolves the glue in the distemper paints. Large sheets of paint can fall, and it's not uncommon for there to be a complete failure of all coats. Deterioration often happens as well when there's water infiltration into a plaster ceiling that causes the plaster to deteriorate, and it can become quite powdery. Paint does not adhere to damaged plaster surfaces. With some of the more modern paints, there's a problem with vapor permeability. An application of a shellac or varnish over paint can freshen it, but it also makes it impermeable. The impermeable paint traps water that has infiltrated wall or the ceiling plaster and causes the paint to blister and detach from plaster. Paint will also fail on UV damaged wood, and I can assure you that modern paints do not stick to UV damaged wood. But incompatible paints are also an issue. Some paints do not adhere well to older paints, and this is particularly true For the high gloss paints, those surfaces must be treated first. Paints with many layers will often cleave where there have been varnishes and other clear coatings. And much of this cleavage is due to shrinkage of paint films. As new paint layers are added over old, the paint coating becomes quite thick. With the newer paint types that began to be used in the 30s, the paint will not penetrate the cracks well. These cracks remain. The newer paint films and varnishes are stronger than the older ones, and as the paint and varnish age, it shrank more than the distemperate and oil paints below. These stresses lead to cracking and peeling of the paint coating, which begins at the old cracks. Increased shrinkage of the outer finish layers forces the paint film to curl away at the cracks. On some areas of walls, the paint has adhered so well to the finished plaster coat that the peeling paint coat is taking the finished plaster with it, as you can see in this image. For restoration and repair work in old buildings, we have to know what types of paint we have. For identification of types of paint, we will have to commit to using more expensive and more accurate methods for identifying binders than simply what color was it. One method that's fairly successful is cross-sectional analysis with ultraviolet light. Unfortunately, it involves expensive microscopes and light sources, as well as the knowledge and skill to understand what you see under the microscope. FTIR is another significant tool with broad information about the composition, guides selection and use of subsequent methods, and does not chemically alter the sample. Other types of laboratory testing that are very useful: gas chromatography, infrared spectroscopy, Raman spectroscopy, scanning electron microscope, and others. But please never undertake laboratory testing without understanding what question you want answered. And also use a laboratory that knows about historic paint. If you do not, you will get inaccurate results. So in summary, paint is really a record of the time period it was applied. The type of paint used helps us identify what types of paint were available and what types of pigments were used in that period. And of course, what types of deterioration can be encountered. If the analysis is part of a historic structure report, it provides important information not only about what was available, but also assists in dating the coatings. Working on an old house in the Hudson Valley, we identified the first paint on the existing windows as a lead zinc oxide binder that was original to actually the windows. As this paint was most commonly available after 1850, it told us the existing windows were not installed till after 1850. There are many reasons for identifying the type of paint you have in your historic building, but knowing what types of paint and clear coats were used over time, you gain a great deal of information. Not only does it include how the building evolved over time, it helps you avoid costly mistakes with repairs over old coatings. I want to thank everyone for attending, and thank you to the sponsors. My contact information is provided on this slide for technical questions you might have. I am always happy to discuss architectural finishes. If you have other questions, please direct them to APT, and their contact information is also on this slide. Thank you.